I always get a little circumspect when somebody asks me to speak about anything, and especially a subject like proficiency, because that feels to me like I'm inviting a lightning bolt to strike me from on high. There's an element of being a pilot, there's an element of being any person who wishes to achieve something and build skill that requires a humility. And that humility often means that you should hide your light under a bushel and remember that every day is a new day in the craft. That's certainly true in flying. So I asked Charlie, why did you invite me to speak? And what can I deliver that's useful? And he reminded me of something that was extremely obvious and it had not occurred to me. And that is that you're sitting in the EAA facility, a space built for collaboration. But right out in that glass atrium, there's a room called the James W. Brown Jr. Pilot Proficiency Center, because it's named after my dad. And my brother and I and Jack worked together to create that facility and name it after my dad. And Charlie invited me to tell you what the inspiration was to have a facility like that with my father's name on it, and what that might mean to a community of people gathered for the purpose of learning. So this won't be your typical address insofar as I'm going to talk about a guy, and I'm going to talk about a guy who brought to me some particularly useful life lessons that I'll share with you. I'll start by saying that most wisdom bears repeating. There's not a lot of human axioms that have been made up recently. They've been with us forever. Like, there's a way to live life that's just smarter. Those things carry into being a pilot. So I'm not going to rock your world with novel ideas. But what I hope is that I leave you with something that allows you to talk to other people in your world as trainers, mentors, program managers, that reminds us all that we can go out into the world of aviation way better if we remember how we show up to that job. So the key thing that I'm going to talk to you today, besides my father, is how do you show up to the job, whether it's the piloting job or any job. I want to move to this PPC, Pilot Proficiency Center origin. In this room, we have people who are dedicated to the concept of collaborating in order to make other people safer. And at EAA, for several years now, a decade, we've had nothing but volunteers show up to run this Pilot Proficiency Center to benefit the safety and skill of others. In my work life, frankly, in my personal life, I have never seen such an engine of volunteerism as EAA, and within EAA, the Pilot Proficiency Center. It's absolutely extraordinary. We will have thousands of people come through that center and sit and take advice and counsel from a volunteer CFI who traveled here to give of their knowledge. And they do that because they think it's the right thing to do. And they do that because they're a member of SAFE or NAFI, or maybe they're just independent. They will be sitting at equipment that was donated to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars and is maintained and made ready by a crew from Redbird who comes up a week ahead of time. And they will engage in programming brought to you by guest speakers who come from all across the country for nothing to talk to pilots in the audience. The PPC, centered at EAA, is everything that makes general aviation special, truly. And so I thought, well, how did I get involved in this? And I got involved in it in a couple of ways that bear stating. One is, I came across this company, Redbird, some years ago. I had no idea what it was, but they had red and it had birds on their shirt. And I thought, I wonder what they do. And then I went and found out what they did, and the light bulbs went on. And I realized these guys can change the world, because general aviation pilots have never been able to train like a professional. If they do, they got to go burn gas. They got to hope the person in the right seat is very talented. And practice costs a lot of time and energy if you're doing it in an airplane. And the pros do all this stuff in sims. So Redbird lit my world on fire. And I said, these guys can change the game. So I got very interested in that. I also met this guy, Radek Vizikowski, who started IMC clubs. Raise your hand if you know Radek. Yes.
Very ingenious guy. And he had the same concept of piling on in a way that brought community together for learning. And then there was my father, who was my lifelong mentor and taught me a lot about how to approach challenging tasks. And that combination of things ultimately ended up in my participation in the PPC. My father, Jim Brown, loved EAA. I mean, he loved it. And I just want to tell you a couple of things about that. He ended up on the board, which was a real privilege for him. He is recognized on the honor wall as my father passed away in 2017. And in the summer of 2018, several families gathered whose lost loved ones' names were put on this honor wall. And my mother and I watched as the missing man formation flew by and the homesick angel climbed away. And so my father's memorial service, as much as anything, was conducted here between Compass Hill and the chapel. And the other thing that I'll tell you about my father is his last flight as an active general aviation pilot was into AirVenture in 2011. It was pretty astounding how that journey to AirVenture ended, and I'm going to talk about that when I get into his lessons. Let me give you a little bit of his bio. Jim Brown was born in 1933 and taken home to a depression situation in society that required his parents to live with 3 other generations of family in order to have a roof over their head. His father, as my dad used to say, walked off a dirt farm in Utah, a subsistence ranch, in order to go better himself, and ended up working for DuPont Chemical Company as a plant manager. And DuPont was famous for not cutting a single job during the Depression. So my father was raised by a company man who got him through the early stage of his life by avoiding poverty.
And my grandfather, my father's father, had aspirations for his only child. And that aspiration was that the plant manager of a chemical plant would raise a child who went to an Ivy League school. We all have our dreams. That was my grandfather's dream. My father went off to Princeton, so he succeeded in establishing his father's wishes. And when he got there, he more or less said, "This is a place of blue blood knuckleheads and I want nothing to do with this." The blue collar ethos, the humble ethos of my father was large and proud. And his high school girlfriend from 9th grade happened to be graduating junior college. She was a little bit older. And so he proposed to her, and there were 2 benefits of that. He got his wife of 65 years, and it also meant that he got thrown out of Princeton because undergraduates were not allowed to be married. And so he transferred to MIT, graduating in chemical engineering, and went to DuPont Chemical to close the loop with his father as a chemical engineer in Galveston, Texas.
And then he had a fateful trip back to his hometown where he had a beer with his best friend from high school, and his best friend said, "How you doing?" He said, "I'm miserable. There's nothing worse than being a chemical engineer." Nothing. And his best friend, who I'm named after, said, "Jim, you need to join the military. That's what you need." After a couple of beers, they went down to the Naval Recruiting Office. My dad presented himself, it was a true story, as a future nuclear engineer to be a nuclear submariner, because he figured his engineering degree and so on lent itself to the emerging technology of nuclear energy. And the recruiter looked at my father and said, "Son, you don't want to be a submariner. You want to be a fighter pilot." And my dad went off to OCS and Pensacola in Corpus Christi, Texas, soon to land on the Bonhomme Richard flying F-3H Demons in the very early stages of jet aviation in the Navy. I might mention that he made that commitment and signed on the dotted line without discussing it with my mother. Imagine her surprise.
This created for my father a lifelong love of aviation. The Navy transformed him. It transformed him in his level of confidence, in his level of how he saw the world, and quite uniquely, it made him very humble. Because in military aviation, you don't ever make a flight. You don't ever do anything that's not graded. You find out very, very quickly that you're not as good as you want to be at the things you're tasked to do. And it changes the way you think about performance. It changes the way you think about how you show up to the job. So I want to talk to you about sort of the 4 things that I think I gathered from my father that have gone directly into the aviation experience that he sponsored for me. Which I'm now aiming to sponsor for my son. Again, these are not complicated, but I think they're pretty terrific axioms. This is how you show up to the work. The first one is, my father was a lifelong learner. He was in everything that he did, but man, was he a lifelong learner in aviation. You might think that if you are an all-weather night fighter pilot in the Navy, which means you're trying to find a boat in the dark, you might think that in the world of general aviation, you're stepping down to a somewhat less significant and severe level of risk. But my father enrolled himself in flight safety to do simulation-based training to prepare himself for the safe and correct operation of an F-33 Bonanza. And my father went to recurrent training every single year for probably 30 years, religiously. And this was a guy that bought a Duats modem. Anybody know what Duats was?
Yeah.
Okay, he had a Duats modem in his office at home. This is a guy who went off to SimCom trading later as he stepped up in aircraft and found himself in a turbine airplane. This is a man who went to the North American Trainer Association training junkets all over the United States to learn to be a formation pilot of warbirds, something he had not done since 1953 in the Navy, and wanted to be a student of that. And so every time I watched my father practice the art of aviation, what I saw him doing was learning and practicing. We worked together for many years. The factory was a couple miles away from the airport, Hartzell Field in Pickle, Ohio. You could hear the SNJ fire up every single day that the ceiling was above 1,000 feet. And he'd go out and shoot 10 landings every single lunch hour. Every single lunch hour. And I thought, this is just beyond loving the sound of that radial engine. This is a guy that believes in practice. So I share that with you because you're going to be around young pilots. You're going to be around pilots seeking continuing education. And if you impart one thought to them, if you see it in them, encourage it. And that is lifelong learning of the craft. Why not? That's the big reward. The next thing he really taught was worth repeating. Again, it's a life skill, but it's certainly a pilot skill. And that is to be brutally honest with yourself. I was going to use the word bullshit. Aviation is not a place where you should ever indulge in self-bullshit. You're not better than you are. You don't know more than you know. And I learned this in a quite extraordinary flight with my father. My mom always used to say, your father was an all-weather night fighter pilot who flew off the deck of the Bonnie Dick. And she said that with terrific pride. If I could imitate her better, you would be delighted by how much pride she had in what my father did in the Navy. So he took me for a flight in his Mooney M20E, 1967. The livery was orange and cream and the inside was brown. Can you imagine? That used to be cool. He bought that airplane used for $17,000, I think, on the day that he got fired. So his response to getting fired was to buy an airplane, which I think might also be another lesson, but it's not on my list. And he was going to plunge himself back into general aviation, having been inactive for a long time. And he took me for a flight early on. And as we're coming down final towards this little runway in rural Ohio, he said, there's a crosswind, this could get ugly. And I said, well, I thought you flew all-weather fighters at night off the USS Bonnie Dick. What's the deal? And he said, well, that boat was always pointed into the wind. This was a guy who never took for granted that he had more skill than he had. I remember when I was a child, I used to flip through aviation books, some from his carrier cruises. And I asked him some question like, man, were you like a dogfighting fighter pilot? Did you do the loops and rolls and all that stuff? I was probably, I don't know, 6, maybe 7 years old. And my father was larger than life to me. He could have told me anything. He said, no. When I went in the Navy, we had to do all the basic aerobatic maneuvers, but I always got bad scores in that. And he said, I was pretty good at IFR, but I wasn't much for aircraft handling. So I had to work at it. When he died, I found in the corner of the closet a box with some of his memorabilia. And in that box was the flight-by-flight instructor critique of my father's performance in basic training. And page by page, it said things like, this is a model student. This student works very hard. This student was very well prepared. This student has a lot of trouble with aileron control coming over the top. And so here's a guy who tells his young son that his entry into the world of flight involved not being so very good at it and having to work harder and practice more. He was always honest with himself about flying, and he taught me to do the same. And I want to reference his flight into AirVenture in 2011. He had quadruple bypass and fought to get his certificate reactivated. It took him a few years. And his plan in life was always to downshift to his F-33 Bonanza when he got older, because for him it was a more simple aircraft. And he flew into AirVenture in that airplane with a safety pilot. A few days later, we went out to the airport to take off. I think we were at Fond du Lac. And it was an overcast day. Very easy IFR in the world of IFR, but still IFR. And he was going to go out in the Bonanza, and I was going to go out in another airplane. And for me, this was a cool day of leaving Oshkosh with my dad and going to the same destination. And we got to the airport. I opened up the door of the airplane I was going to get into, and he walked away from his and got into mine. And he said, I'm not going. My days of flying IFR are over. And that's the last time he ever flew. But this amazes me. He could have done it. He had a safety pilot, but his level of personal honesty was, you got to have something in here that says you're mission ready, and he didn't have it. And it was that simple, and I will never forget it, and I hope to be worthy of that level of self-honesty in my own life. The third thing is 4. So if you're wondering when this thing ends, I'm on 3 and there's 4. The third is be flexible. I was always astounded at a guy who was really a risk taker in life. Pretty big time risk taker in life. Be so humble about flying and be so flexible in mission planning. Be flexible. He used the word maybe a lot. Yeah, we'll plan to go on Friday. Maybe it'll work out. Or, yeah, we're going to leave tomorrow morning. If the weather holds up, maybe we'll have to make a change. And so he always had this mentality of, we have a goal, we have a place we're trying to get to, but how we get there and when we get there might not be what we think. And he tried to transmit that to me in my early flying. One time I was flying from Charlottesville, Virginia to Pickle, Ohio. I was flying in a beach sundowner, and you hear these stories. This one's true. Trucks on the highway were going faster than me. Big headwind. Terrible flight planning on my part, and then some descending ceiling and some of those Shenandoah Mountains, and my dad's German Shepherd and my new wife in the right seat, and me thinking, I don't think I know what the hell I'm doing. So I peeled off, I landed in Parkersburg, West Virginia. I called my flight instructor, who had recently proudly sent me into the world, and said, I don't think I know what the hell I'm doing. I'm in Parkersburg, West Virginia. I probably didn't brief this very well. Can you double check
what you think I'm facing on the rest of the ride home. And he did. This has been the days when you had to have a quarter for the telephone. And we managed to make our way home. And I talked to my dad that night. And some of the highest praise I ever got from him was for recognizing that you're allowed to land, take a deep breath, and regroup. And there were several other occasions in my life after that where a flying decision had that voice in my ear. Well, just be flexible. Nothing says you have to get here today. Now, he was not lazy about completing tasks or completing missions, but he was very keen on the idea that this is a work in progress every flight. The last and fourth thing is have mentors and advisors. This was, again, true for my father in life, and it was certainly true for him in flying. We can get pretty confident, and we can get pretty proficient. I think all of us believe that if you're going to get into an airplane, you should have some base level of confidence in your own skills to deal with what's coming. But it's interesting that you have to package that also with the notion that there's somebody out there that you can learn from. And not only is that wise, but it's joyful. I mean, you all have mentors in your life, I'm sure. These are relationships that you treasure, and my father made them in aviation. He had this guy, Gale Bailey, that he flew with in the Navy, and Gale Bailey was his VFR sensei, because Gale Bailey left the United States Navy, having flown in the worst and most dangerous conditions that you could ever face, and then in his life as a GA pilot, never flew an IFR flight, ever. For whatever reason, he loved VFR, and he knew how to do it really well. I mean, long cross countries in VFR are challenging. So Gale Bailey was my dad's VFR mentor. He talked to him routinely and regularly as he was planning trips. A guy named Larry Zetterlund, who was the chief pilot of Hartzell Propeller, was my dad's IFR mentor. He talked to Larry very consistently about how to do it better, new technologies. He was an early adopter of WAS, my father. I remember him shooting a WAS approach into Piqua, Ohio. And he was like, it's like he discovered, the atom. He was so blown away by the technology. So he had Larry Zetterlund in his IFR world. And you guys probably know Sean Tucker and Mike Goulian. He went to school on those guys. Those guys are so committed to the craft, to practicing, to being prepared, to having a mental attitude that he went to school on those guys. And so up until the point that he took his last flight at age 77, he had always surrounded himself with people who saw this in ways that he knew he could learn from, that reinforced the sense of discipline. So those four things, they always say close with the recap. This is a business where lifelong learning is more important than how well you manage pitch and power for the long haul. My dad never, ever went on a skills-based flight with me. He never said, I think you should handle the pitch this way, or I think you're a little late on your flight. He never talked about the mechanics of flying. He talked about learning. What are you learning next? What are you getting into next? What are you reading? Be honest with yourself. I think this is probably the most important one. This is the thing that kills pilots. You don't have to know everything, and you don't have to be the best pilot in the room. You probably never will be. That's fine. Just love it and be clear what you are, who you are, when you show up for that job. And you'll be safer and better for it. Be flexible, have a plan, but don't be so committed to it. In IFR, there's a missed approach. Why is that? Because you might not land. Well, there's a missed approach anywhere in a flight if you choose to have that mentality. And then the last one is have mentors and advisors. Not because it makes you better, that's true, and that's very important, but because it makes it a hell of a lot more fun. So as you go off today, and you think about your world and educating pilots and providing services to pilots and collaborating with pilots, if any of my father's wisdom had an impact on your thoughts today, if any of my father's wisdom could be passed along to others, well, then we will be worthy of the James W. Brown Jr. Pilot Proficiency Center behind us, and will be worthy of this community that we all love so much. Thank you.